content warnings for internalized homophobia, emotional manipulation, and internalized ableism in the second chapter. Twin Flame Bruise. Written by Nutty Shake on Archive of Our Own. Read by Frog Show Anon. Summary. So, maybe Marcy had a crush on Anne. That realization, having come 7 years in the making, didn't hit her as hard as it should have, due to the fact that Anne was her best friend, and would never hurt her, and that the years she'd spent pining were proof she could keep her feelings at bay for at least 7 more anyway. The issue wasn't even that she also had a crush on Sasha. If the young adult novels she read were any indication, love triangles were a fact of life. And though they didn't usually involve a girl being torn between 2 other girls, books were becoming more and more diverse by the day. No. The real issue was prom was only a week away, and she held 2 envelopes in her hands. Chapter 1. Marcy was only 13 and prone to fantasy, 2 things that usually kept people from giving her thoughts too much weight, but she'd always had the impression Sasha didn't like her very much. It wasn't anything specific that she did. Marcy saw how Sasha interacted with other people, and she was always so open with her annoyance. One could hardly misread it for anything else. But she also saw how she interacted with Anne, who Sasha clearly liked, and it was different from how she acted around Marcy. For one, Marcy and Sasha never spent time with each other if they could help it. Sasha never called Marcy when she was bored to ask if she wanted to go get ice cream, nor did Marcy ever think to reach out to her other friend when Anne was too busy to hang out. But Marcy treasured her solitude, and only broke it when someone else gave her the reason to. Sasha, who was always the one taking initiative in their group, had every chance to make that happen, and she never did. She and Anne, however, hung out on their own all the time, as Marcy's presence, or lack thereof, didn't seem to make much of a difference to them. Marcy rarely managed to get a hold of Anne alone these days. She'd call Anne up, and Anne would say, "Meet us at the new pizza place that just opened," or, "We're at the mall, Sasha needed new shoes." She'd try to talk to her after class, and there Sasha would already be, hanging off of Anne's arm and talking her ear off about some school gossip Marcy wasn't involved in. One time, she caught Sasha staring at Anne when she wasn't looking. Anne staring down at her phone, typing out a quick message to her parents. Sasha leaning forward on the wooden table, as if straining towards her, studying her gestures while absent-mindedly chewing her straw. Marcy was overtaken by something then. It felt like the strike of a match, quickly lit and just as quickly going out. This was where Marcy's most stupid lapses in judgment usually came from, and this time, they pushed her to get up on the table between them in a desperate attempt to redirect the attention of both onto her, only for her to get too excited, slip, and bring the whole thing down, along with their drinks. Marcy would have fallen and broken her neck, had her body not instinctively angled towards Anne during the tipping over, expecting her to catch her as she always did. Sasha, on the other hand, ran in the opposite direction. "What the heck, dude?" Anne scolded her, but she still scooped Marcy up in her arms before getting back on her feet. Marcy yelped in pain when she touched the ground. "Why would you do that?" If there was any reason Marcy ever did anything, she didn't know it. Sometimes her body just went on autopilot, and she obeyed it. There was something it needed, presumably, that it knew she could get no other way. When Anne wrapped an arm around her to carry her, sparing her from leaning on her injured foot, Marcy thought she knew what it was. She almost leaned into the touch. Sasha chose that moment to pop up again in front of her, and Marcy wanted to scream. She already monopolized so much of Anne's time, and Anne had been her best friend first. But these days, Anne only paid attention to her when she was hurt. What else could Marcy do but take advantage of that? But then Sasha shoved Anne out of the way and took Marcy from her, taking care to support all her weight. "Jerk," she muttered, her words at odds with the hands softly brushing Marcy's hair. "Stop tripping over your feet." One thing was for sure. She'd never been close enough to Sasha that she could smell her perfume. It was sweet and fruity and a lot like bubblegum, and she was so warm, too. Marcy could have fallen asleep right there. "Uh-huh." Anne scoffed, laying a hand on Marcy's shoulder. "Yeah, fat chance of that." "Shut up," Marcy murmured, burying her head deeper into Sasha's neck. She tried swinging from side to side, like a baby koala off a tree branch. She'd so missed her friend's touch, so much it was making her giddy. But failed because she had something baby koalas didn't, which was probably a sprained ankle. Sasha, still caught up in protective friend mode, lifted her up without breaking a sweat, and carried her on her back the whole way home. There was a second instance where Marcy could be sure to get her friend's whole, undivided attention. And that was when Anne and Sasha, at least once a week, found themselves at each other's throats. It was always over something small, some injustice Anne perceived on Sasha's part, some note of rebelliousness in Anne's demeanor that Sasha refused to accept. This time, it was Anne not letting Sasha cheat off of her test when Marcy had been ordered to sit as far away from them as possible, leaving the other two to fend for themselves. "You weren't letting me think," Anne insisted, tailing a furious Sasha out of school. "And time was running out." "You didn't need to think, you just needed to tilt your page a bit to the left so I could see it." "So you could have gotten both of us in trouble, you mean?" Sasha scoffed as she sped up, putting more distance between her and Anne, and Marcy, who was struggling to keep up, her least favorite subject being PE for a reason. "For someone who gets you out of trouble on the daily, you could have a little bit of faith in me." Most of the time, Sasha just wanted to be chased and be apologized to. Maybe she'd want that tomorrow, but she clearly wanted to get away now, and if they didn't let her, she would have blown up on them. Things always got ugly when Sasha was mad. If Marcy had been a worse person, she probably would have seen this for the opportunity that it was, and let Anne dig her own grave. Maybe it would have been for the best. Not just for her, but for all of them. Instead, she grabbed Anne's shirt and pulled her back. She still didn't know why her gut churned at the idea of Sasha and Anne together, but she also didn't know how to feel about the idea of them apart. Sasha had become such a huge presence in their lives, and Marcy had grown so used to having her around Anne that hanging out with her didn't feel real unless Sasha was also involved. At some point, the two of them had gotten mixed up in her head. She couldn't think about losing one of them without also losing the other. This was nothing to ruin their friendship over, and she told Anne so. "Why am I always the one who needs to take a step back?" Anne complained. "Why don't you ever tell Sasha that?" Marcy sighed, because Anne wouldn't understand even if she tried explaining it to her. She worked off emotions, and was therefore easier to appeal to. Sasha, on the other hand, was immovable in her decisions, so trying to reason with her would have been fruitless. Marcy didn't care who was in the right or wrong. She just cared about getting the best possible results. Sasha agreed with her method too. She got to find out when, for the first time ever, Marcy showed up at her house alone a few days later with one question. "Why did you treat Anne like that?" She'd always been so scared of Sasha's judgment or Sasha's wrath, which were the same thing. She didn't want her to think she was questioning her. She was really just curious and maybe wanted her own thoughts to be validated. Thankfully, Sasha just rolled her eyes. They were red-ringed and puffy, like she'd just finished crying, but with no tear tracks to show for it. She made hot chocolate for Marcy, and they drank it together on her couch in the middle of a huge, empty living room. Sasha's house was almost always empty. "You know I'd do anything for you two, right?" Sasha spoke up suddenly, whispering into her cup. "I think I show that every day." "Of course. So I don't think expecting something back is asking for too much." "No, of course not." Just last week, when Anne and Sasha had gone to the mall, they'd scoured every shop for a pair of shoes Sasha had actually liked until, at the end of the day, Sasha just looked down and asked Anne for hers. But Marcy refrained from reminding her of that. "See, you get that, 'cause it's just logical. I could ask you to let me copy your homework and you'd do it without complaint." Again, Marcy wasn't sure that was true, but Sasha was clearly leading the conversation in a definite direction, and it would have been rude to ruin her plans. Plus, it felt nice to be spoken about like that. Like, "You do everything I ask you to," was the finest compliment Sasha could ever give her. By the end of that sentence, with that expectation created and lingering in the air between them, Marcy was no longer sure she wouldn't. But Anne needs to be told these things in a way that she understands, so I let her know that she's hurt me. "That must be hard for you." Sasha frowned in genuine confusion, and Marcy realized what she'd said probably could use some elaboration. "You know, 'cause you're always so..." She'd made a face which she hoped resembled the idea of cool, collected girl Marcy had in her head. It made Sasha laugh, if nothing else. Marcy had no idea how deep Sasha's hurt truly ran, but she had a sneaking suspicion it went further than Sasha would ever feel comfortable admitting, to her or to Anne. "It is a bit, yeah. Sometimes..." Sasha paused, considering her next words, or maybe her next move, because she ended up taking Marcy's hand. The touch was tentative, gentle in a way she'd never associated with Sasha. It was as new as Marcy's own sweaty palms, as the flutter in her chest. "Sometimes I wish she was more like us." This, too, Marcy guessed, was supposed to feel like the highest compliment. She wasn't sure it succeeded, and it must have shown on her face, because a flicker of surprise crossed Sasha as Marcy voiced, "But then she wouldn't be Anne." Sasha soon looked down and away again, eyes caught on the rubbing motion of her thumb on Marcy's. But there was a certain upturn of her mouth, a softness in her smile, that told Marcy an understanding of some sort was starting to form between them. "No," Sasha agreed. "No, she wouldn't." So maybe Marcy had a crush on Anne. That realization, having come 7 years in the making, didn't hit her as hard as it should have, due to the fact that Anne was her best friend and would never hurt her, and that the years she'd spent pining were proof she could keep her feelings at bay for at least 7 more anyway. The issue wasn't even that she also had a crush on Sasha. If the young adult novels she read were any indication, love triangles were a fact of life. And though they didn't usually involve a girl being torn between 2 other girls, books were becoming more and more diverse by the day. No. The real issue was prom was only a week away, and she held 2 envelopes in her hands. She didn't think it was fair that her love choice came with a deadline. She would never have the time to go through the character arc she needed to understand what she wanted from life and who could give it to her, and get to the mythical "oh" moment where love would reveal itself at just the right time, in just the right place. Besides, for all that her heroines lamented wanting both of their love interests equally, Marcy was always able to guess which one she'd pick in the end, either because the narrative had a special regard for them, or because they happen to come up more often in the main character's musings. But Anne and Sasha were always as paired up in Marcy's head as they were outside of it. Sometimes she'd be lost in her own world, thinking about Anne's smile, and there Sasha would be, demanding Anne's attention and thus succeeding in redirecting Marcy's as well. And sometimes she'd be looking at Sasha and picturing what it would feel like to kiss her, and then Anne would make a joke, and they'd all be laughing, and the warmth in her chest would sneak through the spaces between her ribs to fill the rest of her body, right to her fingertips. That didn't mean her individual relationships with them were interchangeable, or even similar, but they fulfilled the exact same purpose in her life and occupied the same space in her thoughts, which made it nearly impossible for her to just pick one of them and try to cut out the other. She considered the blue envelope and its contents, then the red one. Finally, she put both aside and started writing on a new, single piece of paper, trading personalized decorations for love for efficiency. A simple prom did the job just fine, requiring none of the emotional vulnerability, but preserving all the plausible deniability. After all, friends with no romantic feelings for one another asked each other to prom all the time. And since she decided right then and there that, for that very reason, they couldn't turn her down, since just the thought of them rejecting her in any way, or possibly always, made her feel sick, she purposefully left out no as an option. It was all pretty reasonable, she told herself the next day, walking through the hallway to Anne and Sasha's lockers. 100% guarantee of success. She was only gripping the piece of paper so tight because her hands were too clammy. And her hands were only too clammy because it was an abnormally warm February. The fact that Sasha was coming into view, all bundled up from head to toe, meant nothing. Marcy and Anne had always suspected she was secretly cold-blooded. "I'm telling you, the heating is just broken," she was complaining to a smug Anne, who occasionally broke off Sasha's rant to offer an, and sure it is. "This is ridiculous. Marcy, you saw my last blood test." She didn't miss a beat. Values were only mostly in the human norm, within 0.7% chance of you being an as-of-yet unidentified cryptid. "Open your heart to us, Sasha." Anne draped herself over her, in pure Anne fashion, arms wrapping around Sasha's middle as if to provide additional warmth. "We'll keep your deepest, darkest secrets." "Yeah, like Gabby promised to keep Carlos's secret. Leave me alone." Sasha laughed, trying to literally get Anne off her back. It was a bright sound, and more affectionate than anything Marcy was used to hearing from Sasha. Marcy felt lost on all accounts here. "What's Carlos's secret?" "You don't know Carlos's secret?" Sasha asked, at the same time Anne said, "Nope, not supporting this. We shouldn't even know. Carlos asked both Bridget and Joanna to prom, like, unbeknownst to the other. Guess he didn't want to keep all his eggs in one basket." "Well, that seems messy," Marcy said. "He could have at least been open about it." "I mean, why would he? That's such a cheap move. I can't imagine ever being okay with it." "Yeah, like, just pick one, dude," Anne agreed. "Doesn't bode well for your future relationships if you admit to cheating before you even start dating. That's bound to backfire on you." Marcy suddenly wanted nothing more than to get out of there. Out of the school, out of Los Angeles, out of existence, maybe. She wished for the ground to swallow her up, and for that thing in her hand to have never been written. She'd been so stupid, and greedy, and selfish. Of course she couldn't have them both. What kind of pipe dream was she chasing where that was allowed? Where things worked differently for her than they did for everyone else? She should have been grateful her friend stuck around for her, no matter what a mess she was. And yet there she was, threatening to burn the one good thing in her life to the ground because she wanted too much. She felt sick inside. She wished for all the ugly feelings that were stored inside her to be relocated to one limb so that that limb could be amputated and she'd never have to think about it again. But things were really so easy for her. I'm so glad I can skip the whole promposal thing this year, Anne sighed, looking at Sasha with gratitude. Any jerk who asks me, I can just tell them I'm going with one of my best friends. Marcy's eyes flicked between her friends. Sasha's eyes did the same, but they stayed on Marcy a bit longer. One? Sasha asked me. Anne's smile was completely oblivious to Marcy's internal turmoil. You weren't planning on going to prom, were you? Sasha frowned, as if the thought had just popped into her mind. I mean, you never mentioned it, and last year we had to beg you to come. Marcy remembered the past year's disaster. Anne and Sasha had planned to spend a nice night, just the three of them having fun together, and Marcy had ruined it for them by getting overwhelmed only an hour in. There were so many people, and she couldn't hear any of them talk under the blasting music. She just followed her friends around like a lost puppy for the whole night, laughing when they laughed and freaking out when they disappeared in the crowd. Her anxiety had been rising and rising until it became noticeable, and her friends had to leave their most anticipated night of the year early to walk her back home. She didn't know why she hoped this year would have been different. Maybe she was expecting the thought of her feelings being returned to carry her through the night, or maybe her friends had been right not to count her in their plans at all. They still could have asked to let her know that she was wanted, that she hadn't ruined everything last time. Nope, no, I wasn't planning on it. The invitation in her fist was all crumpled up. She tore it to shreds in a garbage can as soon as the bell rang and Anne and Sasha were out of view. Marcy hadn't forgotten about Anne's birthday, though she had gotten distracted by a book on magic music boxes for a moment there. In fact, it was Anne she was thinking of when she decided to spend her afternoon at the library instead of joining her friends at school. Despite their not-so-excellent grades, Anne and Sasha would have a good future. They were extremely smart in ways that standardized tests couldn't measure, and they'd have no issue making the connections they needed to find themselves in a position of leadership someday. But Marcy, who'd been taught to believe standardized tests were the only true guarantee of success, only had her brain. She'd always been too busy reinforcing that idea for herself to pick up any important life skills, like the ability to look people in the eye or hold a conversation. And so, this was all she had to sew for herself. She couldn't afford to not even be good at it. She didn't want her friends to carry her through life forever. She was already such a burden on them. She wanted to get to a place where she could give something back, where she got home after class and they came home tired from work and she could take care of them, just like they regularly took care of her. She was only 13. She shouldn't be thinking about this stuff. The future she pictured for them wouldn't come for at least 5, maybe close to 10 more years. But the prospect of it did more for her motivation than her parents' expectations for her did. And it made her feel better about Anne and Sasha having fun without her for one afternoon, because she was working hard to be with them for the rest of her life. And then her father called her back and told her that time was being cut short. Marcy had never been very good at getting what she wanted, whether she was just unlucky or whether she had trouble reaching out and taking things for herself. She'd never know. But what she lacked in assertiveness, she could usually make up for in thorough planning. Her life this far had been nothing but a work in progress, a careful building towards the day all her efforts would finally pay off. She hadn't planned for this. In a matter of weeks, she'd be pulled away from Los Angeles and left to fend for herself in a new school, and Anne and Sasha would finish what they'd started and drift away from her entirely. She couldn't wait 5 more years. She ran out of her parents' home now and kept running until she couldn't anymore, begging her brain to come up with a solution. But all her brain did was laugh at her, because she'd already found the thing it was useless at. What are you gonna do about it? It taunted. What are you going to do? There was a familiar music box sitting on the shelf of a thrift store and caught in her line of sight like a sign from the universe. Marcy wasn't going to let this one, too, pass her by. She refused to be left behind again. Marcy couldn't remember the last time she and Anne had been close like this. Maybe it had been when they were babies. Anne had always been very free with her touch and affection, and Marcy hadn't yet learned to feel guilty about hers. But this was definitely the closest they'd been in years since they met Sasha. Just the two of them, spending every waking moment together and having their own private little adventures on the side. Part of Marcy said this was exactly how things should be, how they should have been all along. That this was all the confirmation she needed to know that stealing the box was worth it. Anne's arm was wrapped around her waist, and she kept poking her in the side when Marcy went on a tangent about Wartwood architecture, or farming techniques, or Amphibia history. Marcy couldn't help it that everything in the small town was fascinating in a way Utopia could never hope to be. She wanted to take root here, build a nice house, and never leave. The other part of her couldn't wait to go out and look for Sasha. "I miss her," she murmured as she played with Anne's fingers. They were sitting by the water fountain in the town square, and Anne was looking at her intently, though she'd clearly tuned out of the conversation about 5 minutes earlier. That caught her attention again. She didn't need to ask who Marcy was talking about, because the subject of Sasha always hung in the air between them, unspoken. "Me too," Anne said, and she tightened her grip on Marcy's fingers in that peculiar way of hers, like she could have crushed them, but chose to hold them gently instead. "But Marcy, when we find her, she might not be the Sasha you remember." "I've changed too," she said. It had been a surprise to her how taking that first step towards independence had only led her to taking more. There had been days where she'd almost forgotten about Anne and Sasha still being out there, looking for her, and when Anne had left her alone in Utopia, chosen to run after the planters over staying with her, Marcy'd wondered if it had been just the same for her. Maybe they needed this time apart to become who they were meant to be. Now, Marcy sometimes caught Anne blushing at her, like right now, and she didn't know what exactly was doing it for her, but she would have liked to, so she could keep doing it forever. Forever. That was such a nice word. "Yeah, but you've changed for the better. Sasha, if anything, she's just grown more into herself." "Is that a bad thing?" Anne scoffed. "When it comes to Sasha, yeah." Anne had told her, in not so many words, what had happened at Toad Tower. None of what she'd said was actually surprising to Marcy. Sasha had always been so unapologetically herself, even with her flaws. It was Anne who had wanted to believe she was something else entirely. Marcy envied Sasha. All she had were secrets upon secrets that kept piling up. "She loves you," she whispered, leaning back on Anne's shoulder. Anne held her there, free hand tangling into Marcy's hair, and Marcy had to close her eyes against the setting sun and something else. "I know she's difficult, but she'd never do anything to hurt you." "I know," Anne sighed. "I guess maybe that's not enough for me anymore." Marcy wanted to ask if she could ever forgive Sasha for what she did, but she decided not to. She was too afraid of the answer. Marcy had seen this before. Well, not this exactly. Not this hallway, empty except for a piece of paper she was desperately trying to avoid. Not this nightmarish version of her friends towering over her and spitting every one of her fears back at her. But the idea of it was written across years of her life, details and impressions she mused on for way too long, morphing into a Frankenstein monster of her psyche. "And it's sent us to a place where we'd never have to grow apart, where the three of us could be friends forever together." It was a scene that might as well have taken place in Andreas's throne room, and yet, it felt significant that it didn't. How could you, Marmar? How could you? I've been missing my parents, my life. You betrayed us. That's such a cheap move. I can't ever imagine being okay with it. It was a nightmare, yet none of it was fake. This is what had happened, would happen, when she told them everything. Sasha wrenching her hands away 10 seconds into Marcy's confession, looking at Marcy like this was crossing a line, like this was the one thing that was too atrocious for even Sasha Waybright to forgive. Anne, the kindest person in the whole world, following shortly after, backing away from her like she was a disease. She'd only said a fraction of what she wanted to. It's too late. We want nothing to do with you ever again. Marcy looked up at the creature they'd merged into like she'd watched them turn their backs on her. She'd been, and still was, the thing keeping them together by sole virtue of her being the thing that they stood united against. Anne had sworn off Sasha's friendship, had nearly tried to kill Sasha and the turrets, and still they agreed on this, the mess she made, and were immediately willing to put their issues behind and trust each other again. Marcy had read about this, how, according to the Greeks, humans used to have 4 arms and 4 legs and 2 heads, how the gods had then cut them apart and the 2 halves were left looking for each other forever, and that was how soulmates came to be. There were different versions of the myth, of course, some stating that these legendary humans were always half male and half female, others stating any gender combination could occur, but they were only ever split into 2, and it was only 2 who could become one again. I just didn't want to be alone. Shame rolled down on her like a crumbling building and buried the rest of her words inside her the moment her knees hit the ground. File transfer, 99%. Estimated time remaining, 3 seconds, 12 milliseconds. Error. File transfer interrupted. Try again. The last Christmas before Amphibia, you helped the Boonchoy set up the tree. Anne did most of the heavy lifting, carrying the tree from her parents' car into the living room. You were trusted to take care of the lights, though you'd mostly caused a neighborhood-wide blackout the previous year, and Sasha hung the garlands and tinsels around the house. The latter may or may not be connected to the mistletoe Anne found on her bedroom door, but if Sasha knew anything about it, she didn't say. After dinner, the Boonchoys left the 3 of you watching movies on the couch, wearing your fluffiest pajamas and drinking hot chocolate. You were wearing a Christmas hat, and despite Sasha's rule of sleepovers going until sunrise, you fell asleep before anyone else on Anne's shoulder. They chose not to wake you, and you kept hearing their polite giggles, their whispers, well into the night. You kept holding on to the small kindnesses like these to prove to yourself that they care. Yet, they watched you die, and they didn't come to rescue you. It would have been fruitless, anyway, but they didn't even try. Your heart may love them as much as you wish, Marcy Wu, but they will never love you back. Don't you think it's time to say goodbye to those childhood friends of yours? File transfer, 100%. Download complete. Chapter 2. When Marcy opened her eyes, the rest of her body wasn't working. It was a feeling she'd gotten used to over the past few months, her neural connections having been severed and handed over to someone else. What made this particular instance terrifying was that this time, there was no one else in there. It was just her, alone, in a body that refused to respond to her and give a physical outlet to her panic. She couldn't turn on her side or kick the covers off, but her chest still heaved as it tried to take in as much air as possible. And then her breath hitched, and a sob managed to make its strangled way out of her throat. And it was then that she decided to make the most of what little she could actually do. She'd take her body back, bit by bit. She'd make her presence known if it killed her. Something moved in the room she was in. As it was, she could only see a wood-tiled roof over her head, and her memory was too slow to pinpoint exactly why it looked so familiar before a face swam in her field of vision, hovering above her. "Marcy?" Curious brown eyes peered down at her under a tangled mass of equally brown hair. Her heart remembered before her brain did. Marcy couldn't feel pain either, which was maybe the only upside to this whole thing, but she swore something in her still ached. "Anne?" It was barely a whisper, but Anne politely waited for Marcy to finish rattling it out before rushing forward. Anne didn't even try to hug her. She just dropped down on her, going as limp as Marcy's whole body felt. Someone else came up on her other side, too, and threw their arms around Marcy's neck and held her so tightly it almost cut off her breathing. She still smelled of bubblegum, even under the more acrid tang of amphibia that clung to everyone's skin. "Sash, don't speak," Sasha said, sounding infinitely small. "We didn't know if you'd ever wake up. Save your strength." Marcy's system was a mess of mixed responses and brain chemicals as it got used to her presence again. She knew because she literally felt the adrenaline that had sustained her in the fight and possibly kept her alive after come down as her friends held her, and she had the sudden urge to laugh until her throat was scratched and bloody. She hadn't fought off Amphibia's greatest minds to come back to herself and stay silent now. "Let me look at you." She didn't care if she sounded like she was begging. Her world had already ended once already, when she died with her friends hating her. It could end again for all she cared, if this time around she at least got the opportunity to make things right first. Anne and Sasha immediately complied. They didn't stop holding her, not for 1 second, but they backed away just enough so that she could see them, front and center. Anne snaked an arm around her back to help her sit up as Sasha fluffed up her pillow, so she could also see the rest of the room now. The planter's basement, of course. All of Anne's things were still where Marcy had last seen them, but Sasha had scattered around her own stuff too. Sasha's armor laid next to Anne's Battle of the Bands outfit, her guitar next to Anne's bass, and one of Anne's magazines was open face down on the floor, next to 2 makeshift beds that had been laid out almost on top of one another in a corner of the room. Marcy, on the other hand, seemed to be in a real bed, or at least on a real mattress. Anne and Sasha were in their pajamas, and the light coming in from the window was pale and dim, so she could only assume it was night. They'd been sleeping, possibly even finally resting after the heat of the battle, and they'd sprung up and ran to her because they heard her whimper. She'd missed them so much. She wanted them to know, and she wanted to touch them to make sure that they were real and not just more of the cruel illusions the core made to trap her in her mind. But she couldn't. "I can't feel my body." She thought it was important they knew, both so they could keep track of any adverse side effects, and so that they didn't wonder why she wasn't hugging them back. Anne rolled off to the side immediately, perhaps worried they were crushing her. Sasha, on the other hand, seemed to understand what she meant. She was wearing her hair down, which framed her face messily. It made for a vulnerable look that Marcy wasn't used to seeing on her. She took Marcy's hand, ran her fingers over it like tiny pinpricks. "Do you feel that?" "Yeah." "You feel it. That's good news." She seemed to be watching Marcy's face for confirmation, but Marcy couldn't nod, so she just made a noise of assent. Her other hand was taken by Anne, who went on to do much of the same thing. What about this? Yeah. And this? And I don't think this is doing what you think it's doing. I'm doing what you are, Anne insisted, holding Marcy's hand directly to her cheek. You're scaring her. Her heart rate's gone up to like 6,000. It's fine, Marcy promised, hoping that the simple reassurance, if delivered with enough desperation, would be enough to keep them from pulling away. Their hands on her were her only point of contact. She felt numb everywhere else. I feel it. I just can't move. Please, don't leave. It might not have gotten them to stop worrying about her. Sasha's fingers still circled her wrist, checking her pulse, and Anne looked even more alarmed than before, like she'd found her friend to be even more fragile than she thought. But it did get them closer again. More specifically, it got them to pull the covers back. Never, Anne said, climbing in after Marcy immediately. Marmar, we're never leaving you, okay? We're here for you, Sasha concurred. We'll take care of you. You don't have to worry about anything. They wrapped themselves around her and tried to talk her into sleep, offering reassurances and hushing sounds and stories of fun adventures they'd had in their time apart. They'd talk about the really big stuff later. For now, they could pretend to live in a world where Anne's greatest distress had come from trying to keep Hop Pop from getting scammed, and where Sasha had had the time of her life leading a town-wide rebellion. They kept going like this until they were too tired to keep speaking, and Marcy too tired to keep listening. She kept looking, though. At some point in the night, Anne and Sasha's hands sneaked out of the covers to touch, and they stayed entwined there, over Marcy's stomach. They stared at each other from across the small bed, eyes never wavering, and Marcy felt caught in it, too. In popular thinking and abstract reasoning, it's common to associate the brain solely to logic and rationality, with the heart being responsible for love and all other feelings. The Calamity Gems reflected that idea, separating heart from wit. And so did the core, who had tried everything in its power to erase Marcy's feelings. But Marcy knew the truth, which is that the brain is the one in charge of all cognitive processes, the rational as well as the irrational. A conglomerate of Amphibia's greatest minds was always bound to have an equally great untapped potential for love, and that had been its undoing. Marcy, who according to the core was the brightest of them, liked to think that this meant that she had a certain affinity for that sort of stuff as well. Something had happened between Anne and Sasha while she was gone, and while it didn't take Marcy a lot of time to figure out, she couldn't help but wonder if Anne and Sasha were aware. Granted, Marcy had a lot of free time these days, and she filled it by getting accustomed to her body again, and to the world around her, and observing the people she loved. So some of it might have just been the conjecture of a bored mind left with nothing to do but rest. Yunin and Olivia helped her bathe and dress up in the morning, then some Newtopian nurse looked over her physical therapy, and she spent the rest of the day being wheeled around Wartwood, eating to regain her strength, and talking to the villagers to regain some sense of normalcy. Still, some things stood out to her, and she noticed. She noticed, for example, when Anne and Sasha rounded the corner hand in hand and, seeing her reading in the garden, dropped them immediately. She noticed them talking in hushed tones in the kitchen when the basement door was ajar, Anne touching Sasha's shoulder and leaning into her and Sasha's soft, unintelligible replies. She noticed when Anne chose Sasha's training ground as the spot for her and Marcy to hang out at, and how she kept throwing glances Sasha's way whenever there was a lull in conversation. Again, came Grimes' voice, who was moving back into position. On his cue, his and Sasha's swords bristled in the air again. Marcy couldn't blame Anne for looking. This was when Sasha was at her best, all her fierceness and rage channeled in the fight, eyes glinting under the stray locks of blonde hair that had escaped her ponytail. Like Marcy, Sasha couldn't be still for very long. But while Marcy's energy was aimless, Sasha always found a way to redirect it toward a cause she believed in, be it defeating an evil Newt King once and for all, or protesting for better food in the school cafeteria. Sasha found herself in the action, and with it, she found purpose. She seemed to notice their eyes on her. Anne's. She noticed Anne's. Her eyes never left her face, and smirked, visibly entering showing-off mode. This was her cause now. This had always, perhaps, been her cause, catching Anne's attention and keeping it. She was just a little bit faster, putting a little bit more strength in her blows, and when she had Grime down at sword point, she threw a glance their way to see how the fight had been received. Marcy had no doubt Sasha had gotten what she'd wanted. Anne hadn't spoken for about 10 minutes, and even if she tried at one point, Marcy certainly wouldn't have noticed. Everything in Sasha seemed to soften at once. Her shoulders, her demeanor, her smile. Because Anne had been watching, open-mouthed, Sasha had become the vulnerable girl from the other night again. Only to be reminded that the fight wasn't over yet by being absolutely decked in the face. "I'm not about playing dirty," Grime gritted out, jumping up again. "We march on Utopia in a week. If your friends aren't gonna train with us, maybe they should be somewhere else." Marcy, who would have very much liked to train but was only just regaining the feeling in her legs, looked expectantly at Anne. Anne, who was always down for a good sword fight, muttered something about needing to get lunch under her breath, and she and Marcy left the scene. It should be pointed out that by getting lunch, Anne really meant grabbing something off Hop Hop's stand while he wasn't looking, which had them scrambling to get away as fast as Marcy's wheelchair could allow. Anne kept pushing her all through town, never speaking except for when someone spoke to her first, and always offering words of encouragement to whoever did. All of Ortwood was in fervor today, preparations for the oncoming fight rippling through every street, people carrying crates, forging or trying out weapons, sitting around in the town square, telling stories and delivering motivational speeches. It was also more crowded than ever, what with being no longer just a tiny village in Frog Valley, but also a base of operation for the resistance against Andreas. Any place on Earth would have either run itself ragged with dread over the incoming fight, or spent what could have been their last days trying to ignore they'd be the last. Not Amphibia. They'd learned to take life as it came. The constant prospect of death, or destruction, or annihilation, only made each moment everyone was alive that more important. Marcy, who died twice by now, could relate. It was why she decided to speak. "I look at her too, you know," she said, turning back to watch Anne's reaction. Her friend startled like she'd been lost in thought. "I mean, it's hard not to." Anne grimaced, almost imperceptibly, but Marcy had a lifelong experience in reading her best friend's moods. "This is different." "Yeah? Different how?" Don't worry about it, okay? Just focus on getting better." "How is you telling me what's going on between you and Sash getting in the way of me getting better?" "'Cause Sasha thought it would hurt you. We know you get weird about stuff." It wasn't very eloquent, but Marcy still got the gist of it. She couldn't exactly hold it against them. She'd done her best to hide how much it hurt to feel excluded, how much effort she put into turning most of the time Anne and Sasha likely had planned to spend alone into a group hangout. But sending herself and her friends to another world so they wouldn't be separated must have undone a lot of that work very quickly. As for what she was reading between the lines, it didn't come as a surprise. It was something she'd been afraid of for a long while. But at least now that she knew it was happening, she could stop dreading it. "So you like her?" Anne did not reply. Instead, she made an abrupt stop and then an equally abrupt turn onto the path leading towards the woods. "Oh my god, you do!" "Marcy, I am going to dump you on the track and leave you to the killer pillars." "Please, you can't leave your best strategist to die. Your last battle plan was, let's storm Andres' castle and hope for the best. And it worked, didn't it?" "Anne." Marcy lowered her voice, thinking maybe it was the lack of secrecy that was making her friend so uncomfortable. "When did things change? I mean, last I checked, you didn't even want to be friends with her anymore." Again, Anne didn't reply, but she didn't look like she was going to ignore the question altogether. She also didn't look like she was leading Marcy to her next death. She seemed to be guiding them back towards the planter's home, supposedly thinking it over as they went. Marcy couldn't blame her. If someone asked her when she'd started wanting Anne and Sasha as she did, she wouldn't have been able to answer either. Part of her thought she'd been born with that want, with the lack of them at the center of her. "She held me," was what Anne settled on eventually. The house was empty around them, and Anne was already toiling away on the kitchen counter, cutting and slicing produce into a pot, and even preparing little side dishes with fruit and berries for Marcy to munch on while they waited for the water to boil. Marcy couldn't use her hands, though, or her legs, or any muscle from the neck down, really, and she was afraid she was going to have to remind Anne of that until Anne sat down with her and started going through her food for her. It was still humiliating, to be sure. Anne and Sasha had already spent their lives trying to keep her from dying in a ditch, and she'd expected fighting a technological abomination for them to be the first step to paying them back. But instead, because she couldn't keep the king from killing her, much less coming back right, they were now stuck having to feed her and wheel her around and walk on eggshells around her, because poor little Marcy had already been through enough. Any day now, they'd grow tired of her, and they'd leave her, and they'd be well within their rights to do so. She just wished it would show on their faces when it happened, so she would know when to brace for it. But not like patronizingly or anything. I'd been holding it together for so long, and I'd finally managed to make it back from Earth, and though there was still some tension between us, seeing a familiar face just broke me. Even if that person was Sasha, or maybe because it was Sasha, and I was just so used to letting her take care of things for me. Anne held a blueberry up to the light flooding in through the window, making sure it was good to eat. There was a sense of warmth and familiarity to that kitchen, to the soft sounds of the pot sizzling in the background, to the spoon slipping past Marcy's lips that made Marcy ache. But she didn't try to take control, or tell me what I should do, or insist that she was the one who had to do it. She just held me, and I let her. I told her everything that was on my mind, and she listened for hours. Marcy's insides were getting all tangled up again. She would have liked to have been the one to hold Anne when she needed to. She wanted to hold her just as much as she wanted to be held by her. And now I can't stop thinking about it. She just did something to my brain. Marcy couldn't help her smile, especially when Anne force-fed her another berry to keep it from turning into a smirk. Have you told her that? Well, I didn't mean to, but I couldn't have kept it hidden if I tried. She kept my nightmares away, and one night I just blurted it out. She would have expected Anne to be more flustered than she was. Her dopey smile betrayed no regret. I wasn't trying to get at anything either, not with the war going on and you still in Andrea's clutches. I just needed to say it, you know? Even though we agreed it wasn't the right time. And there was that guilt again. Marcy was glad Anne had someone, despite everything, and she was even more glad that person was Sasha, someone who Marcy loved just as much, who she'd wronged just as much. They deserved to have that happiness together, and Marcy had taken that away from them, too. Shouldn't she apologize for that? Nothing could ever excuse what she did, but didn't she owe them that, at least? I'm sorry I got you into this mess. You really don't have to be so nice to me. Anne looked up from the spoon hovering over Marcy's lips. No one deserves to starve, Marcy. I mean, it's my fault this all happened in the first place. You didn't choose any of it. So I guess I want you to know it's fine if you hate me. You have a right to. Anne seemed to take that in for a long time, putting the spoon back down and frowning at it. She just stared, and Marcy found that knowing something was coming didn't make you any more prepared for it. The simple prospect of Anne realizing she did deserve better and taking her on her word had Marcy wishing she'd done this when she could actually use her legs, when she wasn't bound to a wheelchair and forced to watch all of the scorn, all the hatred slowly morphing her friend's face. Marcy, I could never hate you. Marcy blinked. You should. I brought you here. I took your lives away. And then you sacrificed yours so I could get mine back, Anne insisted. I'm not gonna say all is forgiven, but you've been through enough. You died. You got possessed. I don't even know how you broke free of that thing's control, but you're here now, and Sasha and I aren't going to waste any more time resenting you. We love you. Nothing's ever going to change that. It was sentences like that which activated Marcy's scientist brain, as well as the self-destruct button hidden in the back of it. When she heard something being stated with such absolute certainty, she got the urge to put it to the test. Marcy didn't believe in anything she couldn't prove herself, and she took a weird sort of pride in being able to prove people wrong, even if it came at her own expense. Perhaps having died once or twice had only made her more reckless in that regard. Or perhaps Marcy was just really fucking tired and lonely and secretly wished with every bit of herself that Anne really meant what she said. Do you promise? Of course. That wasn't enough. She needed to hear Anne say the words, at least to delude herself into thinking they could be true, because she didn't know if she could give up her biggest secret otherwise. It had been hers for such a long time, and now she was just going to reach inside her chest, maybe through the gaping hole Andrea's sword had left, and take out a monstrous bundle of shame for her best friend to see. Marcy tried to reach for her. She could move her fingers if she really wanted to, but lifting her hand was still terribly taxing. Can you hold my hands, like we do? Thankfully, Anne seemed to understand exactly what she needed and why she needed it. She smiled and grabbed her hands, all of her fingers held between Marcy's thumbs, and swore, I promise. Then, to Marcy's sustained, fearful stare, Marcy, what's going on? You can talk to me. But could she? Could she really? She'd ascertained Anne to be safer than Sasha, but that didn't mean much when Anne still had as much power over her as she did. Come to think of it, maybe rejection from Sasha would have been better. Sasha, at the very least, was cruel as a state of being. But to be the one who turned Anne into a spiteful, distrusting thing would probably kill her. Then again, what else had she to lose? She'd been so afraid of them rejecting her, but she'd probably be moving from them soon anyway. That is, if they all made it back from Amphibia in the first place. She'd been openly resented and stabbed and possessed. What more could be done to her? What more could be taken from her? She opened her mouth to start a sentence about half a dozen times, only to settle on, Do you want to know how I broke free. Anne held her gaze. Sure, if you want to tell me. Oh, Anne. It was so easy. I'd just been thinking about it all wrong. The words started flowing out of her as she walked Anne through her thought process, like she always did when strategizing or DMing or trying to solve a math problem. You see, the Corps held the most brilliant minds of Amphibia. Of course, I wouldn't be the one to outsmart them all, but that doesn't mean the hive mind didn't have a weak spot, because those weren't just minds. They were people once. People with a life and loved ones and all the memories that made them who they were. The Corps tried to erase all of that, but it just couldn't have functioned as well without it. Because the head and heart aren't separate. Do you understand what I mean? Anything with a memory has a soul. It came out of Anne so quickly, so thoughtlessly, that Marcy figured she must have been quoting someone else. She nodded. It meant those people had to be in there somewhere. I didn't need to beat them. I needed to free them. Which was easy, because fire catches quick when you share a hive mind. The smallest spark reaches everyone, and before you know it, hundreds of thousands of millions of memories and feelings and faces are all flowing in, and everyone is burning. She looked at Anne only long enough to make sure that she was still following, then immediately turned her face away. She didn't need to look at her for this. She probably would never be able to look at her again. I thought of you two. How much I didn't want to hurt you. How much I loved you, even if... She swallowed down the rest of her doubts. Even if you didn't love me the same way. Anne's voice seemed to come from so far away. Marcy couldn't even tell what lay underneath it, and still it kicked her fight-or-flight response into gear. Marcy, I held it in for so long, Anne, but it saved me in the end. I can't keep pretending it doesn't exist. Marcy, I had no idea. That's when the regret started seeping in. What had she done? Anne had just told her she and Sasha didn't want to hurt her, that was why they hadn't acted on their feelings yet, and now there she went, not only confirming it for them, but telling them the hurt would have gone even deeper than they'd imagined. And yet part of her wanted to scream, how did you not know? How did you not realize that I was rotten? She'd been alone in this for so long. Maybe if they just paid a little more attention. I mean, Sasha, I expected. Anne continued. It caught Marcy so off guard that it actually stopped her rapidly spiraling train of thoughts. I always assumed she knew you felt that way for her, and that's why she didn't want to tell you about us. You just understood her in a way I never could, and she seemed to understand you just the same. I felt like I was always struggling to keep up. Marcy did not understand. She could buy that Anne had been unaware of her own feelings, but that she'd been so unaware of Marcy's, of Sasha's? When she and Sasha had been playing a silent tug-of-war all along, each wanting Anne's affections to herself. Then little innocuous moments started flashing before her eyes, and Marcy could see how easily Anne had misconstrued them. Marcy sinking into Anne's arms to keep herself from falling, only to be lifted out of them and onto Sasha's back. Marcy always taking Sasha's side in an argument because she cared more about preserving what she held dear than potentially disrupting it by trying to make it all better. All that time Marcy had been pining, she kept her feelings so close to her chest that none of them had ever gotten through to Anne at all. Marcy had said already that she loved them both, but that would never be enough for Anne to believe her. She needed to address her directly, to see her directly, as her own person, and not just as a part of the Anne and Sasha creature that lived in her head. I always admired you so much, Anne. You were everything I wanted to be. She would have liked to touch her cheek, but all she could manage to do was brush Anne's fingers. Marcy's hand shook with the effort. I'm so sorry, I was afraid to show it. She watched the little pieces start to fall into place in Anne's mind, and she finally seemed to reach a certain understanding. But whatever it was, it only seemed to make her sad. Not angry or resentful as Marcy had expected, but mournful, maybe. Her voice coming out in a whisper. I don't know what to do about that, she said. And then, even more terribly, what do I do about it now? Some awful feeling leapt inside of Marcy. She didn't let herself process it. She wouldn't allow herself to hope, not at the cost of the guilt that was sure to follow. Look, I'm not trying to get at anything either. I'm not even going to tell Sasha. The last thing I want is to get in the way of you two. She'd do anything in her power to give Anne some peace of mind, but maybe there was just no peace to be found. It didn't stop Marcy from rambling on, always hoping the next word would be the one to fix those that were already out. I'm sorry I had to lay all this on you. It's just like you said, you can't simply lock feelings away. Sometimes they demand to be spoken. I know. Anne nodded once, twice, 3 times. Then she reached out to wrap her arms around Marcy, letting her curl into her chest like a little kid, or something equally fragile. Marmar, I'm the one who's sorry. You should never have been that afraid of us. It wasn't until Anne started hushing her that Marcy realized she was crying. She'd held it back for so long, but it seemed everything was finally flowing out all at once. She'd shown Anne her bleeding, beating heart, expecting her to be disgusted by it, to finally see how Marcy saw herself and run. But not only did Anne not run, Anne held true to her promise. We love you. Nothing's ever going to change that. Anne finally saw right through her and accepted all of it and apologized. And though Anne had nothing to apologize for, the soft reassurance that you never should have been that afraid of us. While Anne's arms were around her and Anne patted her hair, made her want to sob and sob until her throat was raw. If you want to, then you should be able to tell her, Anne murmured, wiping down some of Marcy's tears. I think she deserves to know. She needs to be reminded sometimes that people love her. Marcy thought about it. She did want to tell Sasha. Now that she'd started speaking, it felt like she would never stop, and not even her fear of rejection would keep the words from bubbling up in her throat. She'd read enough fan fiction to have come across Hanahaki disease more than a few times, and she remembered thinking it was pretty stupid, but she understood it now. The idea of something physical growing in her lungs that would have killed her if she didn't choke it out. When? Her head rested on Anne's heart. Now? Or after the fight? Whenever you feel up to it, Marbles. But if you want my advice, do it before. Give her one more thing to come back to. She was going to tell Anne not to sell herself so short, that Sasha had already done the hardest thing in the world and changed herself for her. Of course she would live for her too. But the smell of smoke and burned food filled the room before she could speak, and Anne had to scramble up to turn the stove off and keep the whole kitchen from catching fire. Sasha's tent was eerily silent. It was only partially so because it was the middle of the night, everyone who'd been sitting around the strategy table having already left shortly before. Most of it was due to Sasha staring at Marcy, frozen in place, her eyes flickering between Marcy's face and Marcy's hand on her wrist, where she'd stopped Sasha from leaving to join the others around the fire. Marcy held her stare. She'd regained most of her strength by now, but she was still abysmally weaker than Sasha. She could pull away if she wanted to, if what Marcy had said had hurt her or bothered her. She'd done it once before, after all. But this time, Sasha just whispered. "What was that?" "I said," Marcy replied, trying not to think about her wrenching her hands away again, hating her, cursing her, "that I really love you." Even in the face of that confirmation, Sasha just sighed. It was an underwhelming reaction, to be sure, but mostly it was a weird one. "Look, I know Anne is worried about me, but I'm fine, alright? I'm not going to do anything stupid. No need to get emotional." "Why do you think I'm doing this for Anne? If I hadn't found the courage to tell you tonight, I would have just told you tomorrow." She could tell Sasha didn't believe her, but she smiled at Marcy like she did, even running her thumb down Marcy's chin. "That's so sweet, Marcy. You're sweet. Thank you." And then she made to leave, and in the split second of her turning around and back towards the tent's opening, Marcy caught her smile dropping. "I wanted to ask you to prom." That stopped Sasha in her tracks, giving Marcy the chance to pull her back. If her friend was still keeping track of her pulse, perhaps out of habit, she would have noticed it racing. "Both of you. I thought about it, but I could never bring myself to do it. I was too scared." Sasha's face was kept carefully blank. "You said you weren't going to prom." "Because you'd made your plans without me already, and I didn't want to get in the way. You seemed so happy to go to prom together, and you clearly weren't asking for a third, were you? I mean, who is, ever?" "We are," Sasha just said. "Marcy, of course we would have wanted you. It's not like Anne even realized it was a date, or that I wanted it to be, for that matter. We totally could have gone as friends, all of us. But that's not what I wanted." It wasn't entirely true. Marcy had fought to keep even the tiniest shreds of their affection, and would still take anything they wanted to give. But Sasha was just not getting it. "I had 2 invitations ready, and I couldn't choose between them. I didn't even like that I had to. I felt like the most greedy, most selfish person in the world, and if I told you, you would have despised me too. So I never did." She let go of Sasha then, fearing that to keep touching her after those words would be overstepping, but Sasha grabbed her right back. "What did my invitation say?" Marcy dared to step more into Sasha's space, checking to see if she would let her, and she did. She laid a hand on Sasha's cheek, and to her surprise, Sasha leaned into it. "That you were the prettiest girl I'd ever seen, the kindest too, and that you didn't have to be so strong and in control all the time, like you were afraid of being seen for what you really were, because it was all lovely." Sasha looked at her behind her eyelashes. She wasn't about to run, which was more than Marcy could have hoped for, but Marcy couldn't tell what she was thinking at all. Not until she saw her face crumple. No, please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "I didn't know," she whispered, more to herself than to Marcy. "How did I not know?" "It's fine, Sasha, really, it's just..." She didn't have the time to figure out how to finish that sentence, because Sasha started crying. Quiet, dignified tears at first, that Sasha tried to wipe away as soon as they fell. But from then on, it only got worse. In absolutely no time at all, she was heaving desperate, body-racking sobs that wouldn't stop for long enough to let her breathe, and Marcy had to keep talking her through it. She was careful to not touch Sasha too much, lest she freak out even more, but it was Sasha who wordlessly reached out to her. Sasha who dragged her down with her to the floor while she tried to get her bearings back. Sasha had never reacted like that to anything before, not as long as Marcy had known her, and not where she could see her. She wondered if Anne had been wrong, and if treating Sasha to the added stress of a love confession on top of an upcoming, possibly deadly battle hadn't been such a good idea. She repositioned the two of them so she could be more comfortable and hold Sasha tighter. Sasha, hey, talk to me. What's wrong? This is so stupid. She managed to choke out, and then she must have felt Marcy freezing under her because she rushed to explain. I'm being stupid. You're not. I just want to know what's up so I can help you, okay? It only made Sasha cry harder. Marcy decided she would just wait for Sasha to speak to prevent herself from making the situation even worse. You keep doing that, she murmured. Saying such nice things, doing such nice things. I never understood how Anne could forgive me, but at least I proved myself to her first. I did nothing to deserve this. It made Marcy flinch. Hearing her talk like that hurt. A reminder, perhaps, that she had something to sympathize with her on, that she also had too many things to make up for, and that she could only hope love would be enough to fix it. I don't think Anne would like hearing you talk like that. She's always cared about you, and so have I. She swept back some of the hair that was matted to Sasha's face, tears gluing it to her skin. Marcy never looked away from her, like that would take Sasha out of the moment and break it irreparably. This was who Sasha was, underneath it all. She didn't want to scare her into hiding again. I'm so proud of who you've become, Sash, but the person you were before, she was good too. She deserved love too. I was awful. You were always good, she said, because she knew Sasha, and she knew Sasha just wanted to hear her say it again. And I love you, flaws and all. Not despite them, and not because of them. Just flaws and all. Just Sasha as she was, as Anne no doubt loved her as well. Marcy had gotten so close to her, Sasha's eyes red and puffy from all the crying she'd done, tear tracks running down her cheeks like dried rivers, and was so full of this euphoria that came from finally coming clean, like everything was possible and the world was in her hands, that she was in for a rude surprise when Sasha pulled away abruptly. She just got up and brushed herself off, suddenly stilted, like breaking out of a spell. I'm sorry, she said carefully, her features schooled back into a vague detachment that betrayed neither cruelty nor pity. I don't feel the same for you. Marcy got up off the floor too, trying to ignore the soft pang in her chest. Knowing didn't exactly make it better, but it didn't hurt nearly as much as she thought rejection would feel like. It's okay, Sash. I don't mind. Will you just remember that? That we want you to be okay? Marcy tried to reach for her wrist again, and this time Sasha didn't let her. This is just a lot, she stammered, not looking at her. I have to go. A whiff of cold air made its way into the tent, forcing Marcy to cling to her cape as Sasha quickly fixed up her armor and stumbled off into the last night in Wartwood. The first time Marcy went looking for Anne and Sasha after everything was over, she found them kissing in a remote hallway of the Utopian castle. She hadn't managed to get a hold of them for days. Sasha seemed to be avoiding her, their interactions limited to Marcy sometimes catching Sasha sneaking glances at her when she thought Marcy wasn't looking. Anne, on the other hand, was too busy making sure everyone's spirits were adequately lifted for the upcoming battle to make time for her. When she was able to, she'd assure Marcy that Sasha didn't hate her, that she just needed some time. But it did nothing to quell the fear that they were all going to die, and that her big mouth had made sure she wouldn't even be allowed to hold her friends one last time before then. But now, finally, there they both were, just around the corner, alive and well, and, by the looks of it, happy. It would have been impolite to interrupt, and impolite to stare, waiting for them to be done, so she backed away and disappeared around the corner again, her insides feeling like an indistinct squiggle on a piece of crumpled paper. The second time, she found them still kissing, but hushed words were being exchanged all the while. Marcy was too far away to understand even the gist of it, and it just wasn't worth it to add eavesdropping to her growing list of friendship crimes, so she left again. The third time, she followed their laughter from the other end of the castle. Anne and Sasha were pushing each other around like kids on a playground and squeaking out grown-up insults such as, "Get away from me, you freaking stink! How dare you treat your girlfriend like this when she saved your life? Did she? Must have missed that. Was it when you were thrown against the wall again and I had to turn blue? I get in the line of fire for you and this is what I get, you ungrateful little... Marcy." By the time she realized Sasha was not, in fact, calling Anne an ungrateful little Marcy, but rather addressing Marcy herself, Anne and Sasha had already thrown their arms around her, and yeah, maybe Anne didn't have a point about Sasha, but she was gonna let it slide, because they were all alive and together, and who knew how long it would be before that stopped being true. "Did you see us?" Anne was saying, shaking her back and forth like a rag doll. "Did you see us dragging him to jail? Forget that. Did you see us beating his ass?" "Guys," Marcy gasped out, breathless from all the laughter. "What are you doing here? I think these are the Royal Guard's barracks." It was only then that Anne and Sasha seemed to become aware of their surroundings. "We were looking for the throne room," Sasha murmured, genuinely confused. "And you? We were looking for you." "Why? So you could take us to the throne room? Duh. What's so important about the throne room? We've seen it before," Marcy tried to say, but it was probably lost on them since Anne grabbed her hand, instantly remembered that she had no idea where to go, and resorted to pushing Marcy to the front so she could lead the way as planned. Despite the fight that had just occurred, the throne room had stayed untouched, like it refused to acknowledge anything that went down outside its walls. The seat of the king's power frozen in time, like ripples of the king's fall, had yet to reach it. This meant that they had found the room entirely empty, looking much larger than it already was. The only things that took up space were Andreas' standards — Sasha tore them down as soon as she came in — and his throne, which would either be destroyed or passed on to someone else in the morning. There were whispers of Lady Olivia taking the throne for herself, though Marcy knew firsthand that her establishing a council was much more likely. But it did seem like a waste, that such a beautiful throne should be in front of them with no one sitting in it. Sasha clearly had the same idea, because right after she was done with the decor, she set her eyes on the other end of the room and, foregoing all elegance, sprinted right to it to plop down on the coral seat, claiming it as her own. It was a visual Marcy very much approved of, and not just because it was as removed as could be from Sasha's last attempt at a coup. "We could have ruled this place," she declared, probably aiming for a more solemn tone than her exhaustion would allow. Wordlessly, she turned to Anne, and wordlessly, Anne came forward. "We would have been damn good at it, too. I can't believe you made me a good guy instead." The throne was adjusted to Andreas' size, so it was big enough for 2, maybe 3 people, but Anne still sat on its left arm, immediately reaching out for Sasha as she laughed. "Please, no one could make you do anything. That was exactly the issue." Anne might have never outright asked for Sasha to change, because how could she when Sasha had made it clear how much she didn't want to? But it was ridiculous to pretend she wasn't the underlying reason for Sasha deciding to take that step. She was only propped up a few inches over Sasha, yet Sasha was looking up at her like she could never hope to reach her, like she was towering over her, and she was lucky to have caught a hand of hers and to be kissing it. She never stopped staring, and she never stopped pressing kisses to that spot at the center of Anne's palm, and it was all too much for even Marcy to handle. She'd grown used to their softness, to mutual attraction. She didn't know what to do with that kind of adoration. She turned away almost as if on instinct, as if it burned her eyes, and faced the windows, but she still saw them reflected in the glass. Marcy? She heard her name being called, and Sasha motioned for her to sit on the other arm, but it didn't register that they were talking to her until Sasha spoke again. Don't you agree we would have done well? Marcy blinked, trying to refocus. Oh, better than Andreas for sure. Yeah? How did you picture us? That was a dangerous question. But then again, it was what they'd asked for. So she fished for more details on that specific scenario as she joined them on the throne. I mean, I guess I have some ruling experience. For a while there, I pretty much ran every operation in Utopia, what with being the king's advisor, chief ranger, royal engineer. With a shake of her head, she got herself back on track. And I know Anne would make the people love her, because she always does, while Sasha would keep them in line. She'd rule with an iron fist when necessary, and be a flawless diplomat for the rest of the time. Anne smiled at her from the other end of the throne. You've thought about this. I think about us. I thought that was clear. By the odd looks on Anne and Sasha's faces, maybe it wasn't. She felt the inexplicable need to apologize for it, or at least course correct, before they told her that wasn't allowed. That they'd agree to tolerate her love when she couldn't help but let it out, not to let it leak all over the place. I mean, I brought you here. The least I could do in the months I was alone was come up with several playable scenarios for us so we'd never get caught off guard. And you made me a diplomat? She couldn't tell if Sasha was really offended or just playing up her annoyance for fun. No offense, Marmor, but I think those days are long gone. I'd be out on the battlefield, fighting to protect the kingdom. Well, what if there was no war? I mean, that's the goal, right? Then I'd be out protecting you. And saying that, she took Marcy's hand and kissed it as well. Marcy's thoughts were reduced to static. You're so cheesy, she heard Anne say, as if from some faraway place. We can take care of ourselves. Marcy doesn't mind, right, Marcy? I don't mind, Marcy confirmed way too quickly, because Sasha was still staring right at her, and her hand was still holding Marcy's, and going against anything she said was unthinkable. Leaning back into her seat, Sasha smirked at Anne. She doesn't mind. Well, yeah, that's because you broke her. Marcy, have some self-respect, dude. I don't mind her protecting us. I think it's romantic. But something Anne had said had struck a chord with her, and there was something she wasn't okay with. She might as well voice it now that her brain-to-mouth filter seemed to be broken. It's just, I never wanted you to be away from us for too long. I couldn't bear it. I regret what I did, but I brought us here so we could be together, and yet, since coming to Amphibia... Well, maybe she could leave that part out. Anne and Sasha looked at her expectantly, and she cowered under their gaze. I'm sorry. I know I have no right to complain about that. About what, Marcy? Her head dropped to her chest. I feel like we've barely spent any time together. We were dropped in 3 different places, leading 3 different lives, and even when our paths crossed, there was always something tearing us apart again. And that's no one's fault. She made sure to add, because it wasn't, and she wasn't gonna let Anne and Sasha think she blamed them for not spending enough time with her in Amphibia when she'd stolen them from their lives. But if I could choose, I guess I would have wanted you to stay with me. She couldn't look at her friends. She felt like all her life she'd been begging them to pay attention to her, to be burdened with her. And yet, every time they had a choice, they chose to leave her. She remembered watching Anne run after the planter's wagon, hoping and praying until the sun was down that Anne's heart would lead her back to her instead. She remembered calling for Anne and Sasha as soon as she was out of the tank, expecting them to have saved her as they always had, and finding Olivia and Eunan in front of her instead. And then how she'd been left alone after opening her heart out because of how unforgivable it was for her to keep demanding things from them. Her eyes burned. I'm so sorry. Hey, no tears today. Sasha easily scooped Marcy up from where she was perched and settled her right into her lap. Marcy's head tucked under her chin. Marcy cried even harder into Sasha's neck. What are you apologizing for? I missed you so much, she confessed, because so long as she kept doing and thinking and wanting shameful things, she'd never run out of confessions to make. After the last few days, I was afraid you wanted nothing to do with me anymore. Hey, no, never. Marcy, look at me. I'm kissing your hands right now. Sure enough, she was. The back of it, again, as opposed to her kissing Anne's palm. Chivalry against devotion. Marcy's eyelids fluttered along with her heart. I'm the one who's sorry. I should have just talked to you, but I was scared. Thinking about it now, after almost dying, it feels so stupid. But no, Sash, it's okay. I know I can be too much, so I shouldn't be surprised that you needed time away from me. I just couldn't stand knowing you'd be risking your lives and that I couldn't do anything about it. I wanted to be able to protect you, too. Both of you. And you did, didn't you? Anne shuffled closer to press a loud, self-satisfied kiss to her forehead. You made the plan. You and that beautiful brain of yours. You saved us. And you're not too much. You're perfect. You and Anne. Sasha paused, as if debating whether or not to press through, or perhaps trying to find the right words. You were on my mind all the time. It took Marcy entirely out of the moment, and of her self-pitying spiral, if only because she was now sure none of this was real. We were? We were? Anne echoed, delighted. Sasha avoided both of their eyes, but she only held Marcy closer. Yeah, I couldn't stop thinking about you, about the three of us together. I'd never really considered that before, and with a war going on, the timing was less than ideal, so I freaked out. Sasha really thinking about her feelings was only slightly better than not thinking about them at all, but she didn't seem to be disgusted or to want to push Marcy away. By the way she cradled her, she'd dare say it was the exact opposite. Oh. Sasha shrugged, though it would have been more accurate to say that her shoulders shook more than less of their own accord. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I thought you couldn't feel that way for more than one person at a time, but my feelings for you didn't make my feelings for Anne any less intense. If anything, they only got stronger, and they were already more than I can handle. I mean, what crazy feats do you need to accomplish before you could deserve something like that? Her head was running. She should have asked for clarification, maybe, for a pause in the conversation so her brain could catch up and understand what exactly was happening here. but said conversation just barreled on without her, unraveling in front of her, not caring if she could keep up with it or not. "There's nothing to deserve," Anne murmured on the other side of Sasha. "We want to be with you, and you want to be with us. Why make it any more complicated than that?" Sasha blinked back at her, clearly caught off guard. "You wanted nothing to do with me until I made an effort to be better, and you were right. Do you think I didn't love you before?" She was fully holding Sasha's face in her hands now, whispering into the small space between them. "When you tricked us, do you think that made me stop?" "But both of you? I feel like that would be pushing my luck, you know? I mean, is that even allowed?" This all felt like something Marcy should not be privy to, but one of Anne's hands rested on her shoulder, her other on Sasha's cheek, so that they were both connected to her through touch, and Sasha still traced lines over that spot on Marcy's hand that she'd kissed again and again. She slipped her other arm around Sasha's middle, watching for any discomfort, and sighed in relief when the other girl melted into her instead. A tangle of limbs they were now. The three of them had never been closer than this. "It's allowed," she said to Sasha, to herself. "You're allowed." Sasha seemed disbelieving at first. Marcy could empathize. Despite proof being right in front of her eyes, this felt like cheating. It felt like hubris, and the old myths that never ended well for anyone. But Sasha never played by the rules. She always wanted more than she could reasonably have, and she'd always found ways to drag Anne and Marcy into it. And now, as Sasha beamed at her, Marcy couldn't help but feel grateful to her for it. Good. Because the war's over now. Andreas is gone, the Corps is gone, everyone who threatened us is gone, and we're still here. I never want to leave you again, either. Marcy closed her eyes against some sudden emotion that was rising in her. It grew and grew until it was almost painful, spreading its wings as if wanting to take flight inside her too small ribcage, then suddenly sinking into the pit of her stomach. "I don't know what happens when we get home," Marcy muttered, holding the hem of Sasha's tunic, like she could just refuse to let go of it forever. "My parents might still want me to leave with them." She had no idea how the situation with her family had evolved, if it had evolved at all. She hadn't asked. She'd managed to shut the thought out for as long as possible. But they'd be going home soon, now, and it'd be time to deal with everything she'd left behind. Sasha didn't let her get lost in her head, though. She ran her hand down Marcy's back soothingly, grounding her to the only reality that mattered at the moment. "Good thing we're not home yet, then," she mumbled under her breath, and Marcy sighed at the vibration of it in Sasha's chest, where Marcy was currently hiding her face. "What do you say we make the most of the time we have left here? Wear something nice and celebrate just being together? We can figure out the rest later." Marcy chanced to look at Anne, and Anne looked back, steady as always. "Oh," Marcy thought, "this is happening." "Just to be clear," she cleared her throat, "you're asking me out on a date?" "No," Anne said. "We're asking you to prom." Prom turned out to be a ball in Utopia. The first continental ball in 1,000 years, meant to unite the frogs, newts, and toads at last, to celebrate the beginning of a new era. The Utopian events Marcy had attended thus far had been little more than chill gatherings of intellectuals and politicians, where she'd mostly just kept to the sidelines, munching on bug appetizers and studying newt dynamics from afar. This party was different, though. It was more people in one room than Marcy had seen in a long time, and more noise than she should have been able to stand, between the mindless chatter, the music blasting from Anne's phone, and the classical music playing out in the garden. One last hooray to the human girls, they said. To the 3 stars. All the attention would have overwhelmed Marcy too, had she not spent most of the evening with her head burrowed in Anne's neck, or in the bubble Sasha drew her in whenever they spun on the dance floor together, whispering jokes and compliments and wry observations about the other guests. Her girlfriends gave her all the attention, all the affection she needed, and she floated above everything and everyone else like her consciousness at the edge of a dream. She laughed in Sasha's arms because of the breath tickling her cheek, and then laughed again as she was passed off to Anne simply because she was Anne, and Marcy was so happy to be dancing with her, and Marcy loved her. She loved them both. She told them every day simply because she couldn't help it, but she couldn't make them understand. The peace she felt at just being with them, the relief of having their forgiveness, it was bigger than her still recovering body could contain. It poured out of her messily, like wine dripping out of an overflowing glass. Marcy didn't appreciate the waste. Maybe if she'd been less herself, less used to smothering herself, she would have known what to do with it. She would have let it crystallize into something, given it a physical form outside herself, so that she could finally breathe again. It was a numbing kind of joy that pressed painfully against her ribs, and it must have shown on her face, because before the current song could fade into the next, Anne slowed to a stop, eyebrows pinched together, and she held her hands out to the 2 of them. "Come on," Anne said. "Let's go get some fresh air." Marcy's gown rustled on the floor, her shoes nearly stepping on the fabric in her haste to follow her. Sasha chuckled under her breath, pulling Marcy close to press a kiss to her temple and help hold her up. Her coordination still wasn't the best, even for Marcy's standards, but one day at a time, she was getting back full control over herself. Maybe eventually her mind would heal too, and she wouldn't have to wake up to nightmares of being trapped inside her head anymore. For now, having Anne and Sasha sleeping next to her helped. It was so easy to fall back asleep with their arms around her. Anne led them out of the ballroom and through the castle, stopping every time they turned into an empty hallway to spin Marcy and Sasha around, the sound of their laughter rising up into the warm Amphibia night when they finally reached a quiet spot in the gardens, away from prying eyes and from the mindless chatter. A fountain spouted multicolored light, pink, blue, green, pink, blue, green, like a signal fire guiding them forward. "You okay, Marmar?" Anne asked as soon as they were by the jet spray and out of view. "You look a little off. Did you need a break?" Without offering an answer, Marcy held her arms out impatiently and head dove into Anne's embrace, sinking into her. Anne, though confused, responded immediately, and soon Sasha was there at her back too. And it was perfect. She could have stayed like this forever. Then Anne touched a hand to Marcy's chin, gently turning her head up, and pulled back just enough to look at her, which wasn't nearly far enough to not make her feel lightheaded. If Marcy only leaned the tiniest bit forward, which she realized with a sudden jolt that was something she could do now, their lips would be touching. And she very much wanted that. "Marmar? What's wrong?" Anne's question was punctuated by Sasha's fingers threading through Marcy's hair, and that was when an issue she hadn't even considered until now made itself known. If this had been a movie, this would have been the time for her to spontaneously kiss her love interest and show them how she truly felt, no words needed. The fact that there were 2 of them complicated things, and her brain was running, trying to find a way out of her dilemma where no one got the short end of the stick. She had no idea how any of this translated on the outside of her, but Anne and Sasha looked very concerned. "I'd like to kiss both of you," she confessed. But I can't kiss both of you at the same time, and I don't know who to kiss first. It didn't matter how stupid her qualms seemed to her. Anne and Sasha would never make her feel stupid about it. They did share a perplexed look over Marcy's shoulder, perhaps wondering how exactly to go about this, but it was clear to Marcy that this was something they talked about in some form or another, which only flustered her more. She was on their mind, just as they were in hers. They'd thought about this, too. With one last stroke of her thumb, Anne said, "Okay, close your eyes." And she did. Of course she did. She felt her eyes closing on their own the moment Anne's touch left, like she'd cast a sleeping spell on her. It took a bit of fumbling around with their positioning, hushed whispers being exchanged all the while. "You go stand beside her, and I'll stay. Alright, we'll both stay in front then. Wouldn't it be better if we all sat down?" But eventually they were both turned into her, close enough to her face that Marcy couldn't suppress a giggle. It might have come out more like a squeak, though, because Anne and Sasha paused whatever they were doing to check in with her. "Is this alright?" Sasha asked. Marcy felt either her or Anne clipping a few stray locks back into Marcy's bun. "We're not crowding you, are we?" "No," Marcy whispered, though barely any sound came out. She accompanied the word with a shake of her head. Then, one of them got closer to her than anyone had ever come before, and their lips brushed against hers. They were timid, like they were afraid to break her if they applied too much pressure, and incredibly soft. They were what she always thought Anne's lips would feel like, when she did think of them. But when her arms reached up to their shoulders, they felt broad like Sasha's under her hands. Her fingers dipped to the hollow of their neck, like that would help her figure it out, and then felt their heartbeat. So this is what a kiss felt like. It was weird. Marcy always needed something to keep her body and mind occupied, something to tap her fingers on, to munch on, to hum. It was like she was always chasing that optimal amount of stimulation that would keep her in the flow. But she'd accumulated so much nervous energy during her time under someone else's control, and then on a wheelchair, that it seemed like she would never be able to sort through all of that. Right now, though, her brain was entirely still. Its only preoccupation was keeping track of the lights flashing behind her eyelids. Pink, blue, green. Then the person kissing her pulled away, and the world was too loud again, and Marcy would have cried like a homesick child, except someone else leaned in and kissed her now. Or maybe it was the same person who was kissing her again, and they kept kissing her in turn, and she kept chasing them when they left. At one point, she felt warm tears dripping all over her face. They weren't her own. She knew it was Sasha before she opened her eyes and found her there, furiously wiping at her own cheeks, trying to muffle her sobs. "Hey, it's just us," Marcy whispered through a wave of affection that nearly drowned her. "It's just us." Sasha shook her head firmly, as if wanting to protest that, but in the end, she gave in to her and Anne's touch, to their comfort. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I can't keep it together." Marcy smirked against Sasha's hair. "Did you cry when Anne first kissed you, too?" "Who says it was her and not—" "She did," Anne murmured. "You should have seen her. Lots of sobbing and sniffling." It was meant to be teasing, probably. It failed only because it seemed Anne was fighting through some fondness of her own and losing miserably. "You're so cute." When Anne kissed Sasha again now, it felt to Marcy not like a wound, but a cycle closing.